Okay, cool. So, hi everyone. Today our first lecture on climate finance is starting. We already had 4 lectures about climate law in June. So today we're starting our 4 lectures about climate finance. And our first speaker today is Lila Rайна from the World Bank Group. Today we will be speaking about the fundamentals of climate finance. Let me just quickly introduce the experience of Lila. Lila works at the World Bank as environmental economist, and she used to work in delivering of more than $400 million dollars for climate resilient forests in Turkey, with high percentage of climate COP benefits protecting people, managed and led 15 plus team to deliver a dialogue series with over 700 key policymakers, think tanks, and private sector. She led carbon accounting, pricing, and financial viability for Central Asian countries. And actually, we met with Lila in Kazakhstan a couple of months ago, and it's an honor for us to have Lila as our speaker today. I think that also Lila will be explaining about the experience during the lecture of her. So please, the floor is yours, Lila.
Thanks, Dana. I just switched devices. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. So perhaps maybe there was some issues with the World Bank laptop. Okay. So welcome and thank you for the opportunity to introduce you to a very exciting field of climate finance. Next slide. We'll today go a little over, climate finance. What does it mean? The definitions, key trends across the world, who sources climate finance, who uses climate finance, so basic climate finance infrastructure. And then I'll walk you through some examples in practice of projects, especially I've led and in Kazakhstan, so that you feel more familiar with the subject. So next slide. So the fundamentals of climate finance start with its definition. And unfortunately, there's no single official definition of climate finance. But I know that you've been studying and you've been learning a lot about climate change, its targets. So think of it just like any money associated with climate change. That's the fundamental thing. Money flowing into any kind of climate action. So the World Bank defines it as climate finance is financing provided by public or private entities. So these are the sources of finance for activities that in whole or in part. So maybe your 100% that activity is climate related. Sometimes it's only 50%, sometimes only 20%. That helps mitigate carbon emissions. So either reduce carbon emissions or supports countries to adapt and respond to the impacts of climate change and build resilience. So covering both climate adaptation and mitigation parts. The UNFCCC Standing Committee on Finance, which was a coalition that was formed, a sub-working group committee at the UN level with multiple stakeholders and country governments, they define climate finance at aiming to reduce emissions and enhancing sinks of GHG gas emissions and reducing the vulnerability and maintaining and increasing the resilience of human and ecological systems to negative climate change impacts. And then CPI, which has done a lot of work on actually trying to account for how much climate finance is moving around in the world. They define it as primary investment, means sole primary investment by public and private sector actors in activities that again reduce reduce emissions or improve adaptation and resilience. So this is how it's currently defined. Next slide. I wanted to clarify some things that we all get very confused in, is that there are a lot of terms that are flying around. So say, for instance, you will hear ESG, you will hear sustainable finance, you will hear green finance. They're not all the same. And this kind of chart helps distill what the difference is. So what I want you to take away from this is today we're only focusing on climate finance. And climate finance is only climate mitigation and climate adaptation. When somebody says that this is low carbon finance, we're only focusing on mitigation activities. And when somebody adds in things like air pollution, lead pollution, things like that, then it'll become other environmental finance, and that becomes broader to green finance. And when you talk a little bit about socio-environmental issues, private sector companies monitoring labor and governance, then you are talking about ESG or sustainable finance more broadly. So this is the way it is split out. So not all sustainable finance is climate finance, but all climate finance is sustainable finance. So I want to leave you with that key message. So next slide. So in terms of how much climate finance is actually needed. So when they did an accounting exercise, which is CPI, which first slide where I mentioned the definitions, they said, well, we're trying to actually figure out how much money is flowing in climate currently. And what they found out that it is roughly 1.2. So the green area bar that you see on the bottom, it's roughly $1.2 billion right now. That's what we're at, okay? And where we need to be, sorry, it's $1.2 trillion. Where we need to be is in the range of $5 to $13 trillion annually. So the needs, when you say, okay, you know, Paris alignment, this much emission reductions, and when you do the costing of how much it would take to actually meet our Paris commitments, we'd come to an estimate of $5 to $12 trillion annually, means every year until 2050 is required. But what's currently flowing in the system is only 1.2, but it's increasing. So you can see from 2011, it's increased fourfold till 2021. So emerging markets and developing economies other than China, they have been getting most of this money currently for climate and nature related investments and an additional amount for sustainable development. But IPCC estimates that we need almost 4 to 7 times more financing that's currently in the system. So the takeaway message is that the current climate finance levels, the money that's flowing around for climate, is nowhere near enough what we need to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees to meet our Paris commitments. So next slide. Now that same green area bar that you saw, that $1.27 trillion mark, if you break it down to understand where it's coming from, this is what it looks like. This is called the Landscape of Climate Finance. Again, CPI, Climate Policy Initiative, produces this. And what do you see from, what are some of the key takeaways? So on the left-hand side, you will see that these are the sources and intermediaries, means where is the money actually flowing from? Where is it originating from? You can see that mostly a lot of money is in the blue, which is coming from public side. But now it's slowly being balanced by the private sector side. When I started working in this sector way back in 2011, 2010, then you had majority public and less private sector finance. So over years, private sector's contribution is increasing through commercial banks, through households and individuals, through corporations, you know, they issue a green bond, for instance. But most of it originally and still comes from public sector, which is governments, national development finance institutions, you have bilateral public finance institutions, a bit like your Eurasian Bank, and you have multilateral development institutions like the World Bank. So those are all on the left side, yeah? And then you see how the money is moving. So the next is instruments. So how do people use that money to get to the outcome of climate action? Sometimes it will be grants, means they don't need to be paid back. Sometimes they are low-cost project debt, means they are You need to pay back, but at a very, very, very small rate. Means your interest level is really, really concessional. And then it could be project level market rate debt, means that it's the same interest rate as the market. So you'll have to pay back just like you would take a mortgage on your house, and you take money from the bank. You'd have to pay back the same level of interest. So you borrow to do climate change work, and you have to pay back. Then there's project level equity, where you are sort of owning the company. Say, for instance, Dana starts a company which is having climate outcomes, so that will come under project level equity. And then, or it will come under balance sheet financing, which is for the firm, if you run a climate tech firm, for instance. So those are the types of ways the money is moving as instruments. Now, this is the left-hand side of the story, is where the money is coming from and who's using it. And now we're moving into the story of, okay, what is the money actually doing? So on the right-hand side, you have the uses. So as you can see, and this is one of the challenges, that most of the money currently is moving to reducing emissions. But as I had mentioned earlier, climate finance is made of two parts. One is mitigation and the other is adaptation. There is very little money going to adaptation, okay? And there's even little money going to both. And then when you see the sectors, most of the money is moving into energy, transport. Very little is moving currently into agriculture, forestry, land use. Buildings and infrastructure also make a significant part of it, but it's uneven across sectors, right? But the two largest emitting sectors, which are energy and transport, they concentrate roughly 70% of all mitigation finance. And the next most emitting industry is agriculture, and that only receives 4% of the total mitigation finance. So adaptation finance, like I mentioned, lags significantly. It's primarily from public sources. So governments mostly finance adaptation. There's not been that much of a private sector investment in adaptation. We've not been able to make the case for them for profit generation from these kind of activities yet, but it's growing slowly. So 84% of all climate finance mobilized in developed economies from private sources are concentrated and moving into East Asia Pacific, North America, and Western Europe. So next slide, you'll see that this is the same blue and red that you saw from the previous slide, and it's broken down into different actors. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because this is all going to come together in the next slide. Let's move to the next slide of the climate finance framework. So what you saw in the blue and the orange in the beginning is reflected in the left and the right side of the slide that you see. You have international public climate finance. So remember, there are two, public, private, and then there's public and private sector climate finance on the right that I'll go through. And then there is outcome-based finance. So activity-based finance is before the activity starts, the full finance is committed. So say, for instance, the World Bank is doing a project with Kazakhstan, and it goes to the Global Environment Facility, which is the first icon that you see on the left-hand side under dedicated climate finance mechanisms. And it says, we want to help Kazakhstan in building their resilience in their drylands. So in that case, the money is already fully committed for a climate change activity. Okay, in advance. So we know what that money is going to do in Kazakhstan for climate resilience. What's the outcome? What are the indicators? Outcome-based finance is when you pay for future emission reductions. So think about things like Dana will have a project where she's trying to get voluntary carbon market involved, and she wants to sell her emission reductions to somebody else in the future. So she's not getting financing right now. She will get finance only when she sells her carbon credits in the future. So that is outcome-based financing. So we'll go through each of these different types of people, but these are basically, it's like an overview of all the people and the funds and that are involved in the climate finance framework. They're not exhaustive, they are more but we just picked out like a couple of key ones on there. So Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, Jeff are big donors under the UNFCCC for primarily public financing. So they work with governments. And then development financing from MDBs, institutions like the World Bank, you have ADB, you have Eurasian Bank, they'll all come under financing from multilateral development banks and bilateral development finance. Then you have private sector, and you have, financial capital markets. We'll just go through this. So next slide. So the primary way currently still money is moving into this climate area is through international public climate finance. And this is deployed, like I said, either through the World Bank, through multilateral, bilateral, multilateral development banks. Primarily going to governments, it's public finance, okay? So there are two big mechanisms. These are not exhaustive. They are more than this, but I'm just giving you examples. One is the UNFCCC. It has the Green Climate Fund established under it. It also has a global environmental facility. We have something called the Climate Investment Funds. They have small sub-funds under them that you can apply for as a country government, right? Clean Technology Fund, for instance, you want to trial the latest carbon removal technology, that probably come under Clean Technology Fund. You have a Strategic Climate Fund. You have a lot of other funds that are only for low-income countries or for countries that are really hit badly by climate change. I haven't mentioned them here. They're not so relevant for Kazakhstan. But there are lots of different tiny funds with a specific objective set up, either for adaptation, mitigation, or broader. Next slide. Another type of financing in this is dedicated climate funds is concessional finance. So how do these projects actually move the money? So 75% of all money is moved through multilateral development banks like the World Bank and UN agencies like UNDP. And they have very limited direct access, means that it's every single activity is budgeted and costed. So only when that activity is completed do you get the money, or you get the money for that activity when you're prepared to execute that activity. So they depend wholly on donor contributions. Who are these people giving money? They're largely developed countries. Sit in the UNFCCC, like Norway gives a lot of money for deforestation activities. The US, the EU, European Commission. So these are all Netherlands. They're all big donors, Germany in the space of climate change. And they have policies and procedures for access that are not harmonized. So each fund will have its own modality. So you have to go to the Green Climate Fund. They'll have their own processes, eligibility criteria that a government needs to access them for. And they'll also have a different mandate, like the Adaptation Fund will only fund adaptation activities. So this is a bit about how finance from dedicated climate funds are actually moving in, and they're only a very small share of available flows, but most of them, majority, are moving through multilateral development banks and UN agencies. As you can see, the per capita climate finance per year received is the most for Oceania, which is, the small island developing state. So think about places like Micronesia, Tuvalu. And even though the money seems a lot moving into Asia, but per capita basis means that per person, it's still really, really low. Next slide. So here we are talking a little bit about MDB and bilateral financing. So even with the expansion of multilateral development banks that we just spoke about and bilateral resources, the contributions will only still meet a very small part of the overall climate need, which is currently it's only meeting 10% of total flows, okay? And those 10% of total flows, as you can see, are primarily coming from the World Bank Group. So the blue bars on the left are the World Bank Group. And then you add on a little bit from all the other different agencies. You have the African Development Bank, you have the European Investment Bank, you have the ADB. they all account. But as you can see from left to right, they're increasing significantly. But overall picture, they're still very small part of the bigger picture where private sector has now started stepping up on climate finance. We'll come to that. But this is only 10% of total flows. The trends in bilateral climate related development finance, if you see on the right, they are primarily, this is a bit like saying, okay, I wanted to explain this concept a little bit, because not all climate finance that's moving is 100% really related to climate. So if I do a forestry project, then if it is the only reason I'm doing the forestry project is because, you know, there's climate change impacts on forests, the fires will increase, I want to build the resilience of forests, then it will be majority 100% of the money moving into climate finance. So that's like 100%. But let's say I'm doing an education project with the Kazakhstan government, okay? And then in that entire project, we're putting up schools, we're putting up curricula, we're training teachers, but there's a very, very tiny part of the project that's actually climate related, okay? And that's, say for instance, you're introducing a climate change school, okay? So climate change school or a climate change course in the school curriculum, that's a very tiny part of the entire financing loan that you're taking for education. So in that case, you're only contributing 10% climate finance. So when you add up all the different projects in a bank, they'll all come together to a certain amount. And that amount is the right-hand side, the one in the green that you see, the trend, okay? So that means 27% or 30% of their entire financing as a bank, multilateral development bank, is moving towards climate outcomes or activities. Okay, so not all activities in a particular project may be climate. That's just a point to remember. So we're only tracking the actual money moving into an actual climate finance activity. Next slide. Now we come to the other part of the trends, which are on the private sector finance side. And they have actually been increasing. But the actual flows remain limited. So currently it's 45% of total flows. When I started working, when I was at CPI, they were roughly around 20, 15. Part of this is actually also accounting, because we get better every year. We're trying to figure out how do we figure out, okay, which private sector finance is actually climate finance, right? But you've seen this because you've seen the huge interest in climate tech in the, lately, a lot of startups getting funding. So there's a lot of interest from investors now to put money into climate solutions. And that might be one of the reasons why we're seeing increased annual flows from private sector investors. Their majority coming from private investors, if you see on the right. Little from households, SOEs are even little. And they're very, very tiny ones coming from non-governmental NGOs, which, accumulate into some bigger numbers when you take them at a larger scale. That was calculated by McKinsey. And majority of the climate finance is driven, for private sector, is driven by corporates, so companies or commercial finance institutions, think like a Citibank, or a big private sector bank in your country. Adaptation and nature solutions are hugely underfinanced. And this is the point that I was making earlier, that there's not much interest currently seen from private sector in adaptation related activities. Next slide. But in the capital markets, global sustainable finance markets, they're growing fast. Their contributions to emerging markets remain low, but they're increasing. So there's, as you can see on the right, the market for sustainable finance has grown rapidly. So now you have almost around $250 billion moving into sustainability-linked debt instruments like a sustainability-linked bond, a sustainability-linked loan, a green bond. I'll give you an example. If Gazprom tomorrow says they want to do a green bond, they'll issue a green bond for $150 million in the capital market in Kazakhstan. And they say, okay, we want to tag the proceeds means whatever 10 million proceeds dollars you'll get from that bond, to only a particular project that Gazprom will execute internally in planting trees, Sakshol trees in RLC base. That's an example of a green bond. I'm just giving you a hypothetical to make it more real for you. So the other issue here is also that there's a risk of greenwashing, because none of these things have a mandatory second or third party verification. They're still majorly more voluntary. There are not many standards that are across the entire private sector. And there's no greenium, means that there's no price premium you're getting extra to do a climate related loan or activity from a private sector point of view. Next slide. And lastly, coming to, again, some more on the public finance side. This is strengthening domestic public investment, environment, and leveraging domestic resource mobilization. That will be critical to catalyze private sector finance. 60% of the investment needs in developing countries are expected to be met through domestic resource mobilization. So we are still in a world where majority money for climate finance, we will need to go to public sector entities, means governments, etc. That's 60%. How do governments account for their how much money they're spending on climate related activities? They'll do something called a climate budget tagging system, and that will help us tell how much money is in the government Ministry of Finance budget that's moving into climate finance. Estimates show it's roughly 134 billion per year, half of which was only in 21 developing countries. So it's fairly concentrated. So very few countries have budget tagging systems in place. I work with Kyrgyzstan very closely in the region to set that up. I believe Kazakhstan has just started working in the Ministry of Finance and AIFC on a budget tagging system. So you will get more information on this in your country in the coming years of how much money your own government is spending on this. But most of the climate finance in the public sector area, there's governments also, there's state-owned enterprises, is moving through national development finance institutions. So China has a development bank, for instance. Brazil has a development bank of its own. India has NABARD for adaptation finance. I'm thinking of what's the equivalent, I guess AIFC and their banking, new kind of banks in the country maybe, or national development finance institutions. But any national bank, state-owned bank, is also public sector finance. Moving forward, next slide. So, like I had said, there are two different types of financing. All the public sector type of financing is mostly activity-based finance, and that refers to finance made available upfront for project implementation. And outcome-based finance, which I'm going to explain in a bit, there are three types. There's results-based climate finance, means that once you get the results, you will get paid. So there's no upfront financing. The second is voluntary carbon market space. You hustle, you get a project, you get a buyer, you construct the project is a 15-year timeline. After 15 years, then you will start to see the money come in when the actual buyer is able to buy the emission reduction that you've created. That's voluntary carbon market. Then there's compliance carbon market as well. The airline industry has set up a target, and they said, okay, according to this target, we're going to build credits. There's a demand. It's called Corsia. And then suddenly people will start buying those credits, and the airline industry, they'll start need to figuring out where are they going to get these credits from. But all of this is outcome based, means only when you have reduced the emission or when you've shown the actual activities outcome, means the actual change, then you will get the financing. Next slide. So the results-based climate finance represents a form of financing that does not need to be repaid. Here, I'll give you an example of a project I worked in Indonesia, where we were working in Jambi on a forestry project. The people who were planting the actual trees or doing deforestation activities, after we had worked with them for almost 7 years, got their first payment. So it takes time for you to build the systems, the monitoring, the actual project implementation unit, get the government financing and pipes from where the money is going to flow, clear procurement, financial management in before you actually get the result of the payment, because people need to be paid first to do the actual activity, which is planting trees. And only after they are planted to a certain level, their survival rate, they have survived, then you get the result payment. So that's a result-based payment. Next slide. Voluntary carbon markets is another way, like I had explained. Their current trends are they've been funneling more than 10 billion over the last 20 years. Now compare that 10 billion with the 1 trillion number that we had in the first couple of slides. It's still very small. Yeah, most of the money is still flowing through public sector. So keep remembering that when we get swayed away by whatever is in, new in the market or newer in the scene. But 10 billion is a lot, but it's still very small compared to the number that's currently flowing. And it's very, very small compared to the number that we need. Okay. So the needs are in 5 to 7 trillion annually. So Article 6 markets, and this is, I'm trying to uncomplicate this. This is all negotiated under the UNFCCC. So the UN has these climate change conferences every year, and they try to set up the rules of the game. Means that they try to set up, okay, who's going to get this credit? How does this credit get substantiated as a credit? Who can get paid? How much will be the price? So discussions like this happen at a global level, as well as in smaller groups like the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative. And they collectively voluntary. So there's no standard for this. There's no sort of mandatory requirement. They do it on their own will. Companies will say, like Microsoft will say, I need to reduce 10% by emissions by 2030. That's a voluntary commitment. Then they start buying credits. So they have to go to a country like Indonesia or Kazakhstan and say, okay, where are you guys reducing emissions? We would like to buy your credits. So this alone, this kind of market mechanism is expected to save the Paris Agreement parties, which is the governments, over around 300 billion per year by 2030, because it can help implement their NDC costs much, much faster. So this is transparent, trustworthy, and robust carbon markets. They have the potential to accelerate climate action, but we have to ensure that they are transparent, trustworthy, and robust. So there are lots of work that needs to be done on the standardization and the verification of these kind of emission reductions. Next slide. And so the end one of the key messages that I want you to leave with is that after seeing all the trends and understanding where the what climate finance is, where the money is coming from, who are the different actors, that we all have to be more creative to leverage more with less. The reason I'm saying that is that the current flows of climate finance, like I said in the first slide, they're only around 16 to 25% of total need. So you're getting $1 when you need to be getting $4. Okay. So we need to be creative that $1 can get $4. And the way you do it is that primarily one of the ways you can do it is that you leverage additional finance from private sector. So it's very important for even governments, climate investment funds, bilateral finance donors, to now look at how do we create $3 extra from the $1 we are planning. If we're putting something in the government budget, can it be used as a fiscal incentive to get more money from private sector? Can we put in, VAT exemptions for electric cars so that there's more electric car manufacturers in the country, and that can get in more investment for electric car manufacturers or electric vehicles or electric scooters. And as a result, you're able to magnify that $1 investment that you've made initially from public sector to get in more private sector investment. That's one of the examples. So private sector can contribute $3.5 trillion of annual financing globally between 2022 and 2050. So it can be done. Commercial banks can provide an additional 2 to 2.6. Asset managers, private equity and venture capital funds could provide roughly $1.5 trillion. So it's important that private sector is engaged. Private sector has the potential to contribute significant capital, but we need to do the hard work of building innovative approaches and strategic use of whatever funds we currently have, blend them or make them de-risk platforms so that we can do more with less. Next slide. And even though the needs seem a lot, I just wanted to put the needs in some context. Means that you're like, oh my God, how are these trillions of dollars annually? There's no way. This seems like too big of a number. So I want to put it into context because actually we spend, what you see is the needs is in the green. Those are the current global climate finance flows. And the needs are in the bottom, which are 8.6. But we in 2020 alone globally spent $11.7 trillion just governments for COVID-19 emergency measures. So it can be done, right? That amount of money is there. If the will is there, it can be mobilized. Fossil fuel subsidies, okay, which are actually subsidizing one of the biggest generators of emissions in the world, are $7 trillion. So if we are able to only reprioritize fossil fuel subsidies alone, we can possibly meet our annual commitment of finance needs. Public expenditure in military defense is 2.2 trillion in 2022. I think it'll probably go higher up this year because we've been experiencing, a very war and crisis in the world. So just wanted to give you some context that it can be done. It's possible to mobilize all this money and do more with less at the same time. So I'll stop here in terms of just broad trends. And now we're going to move into tangible examples. Is that okay, Dana? Or do you want to stop for like 5-minute questions here?
No, we don't have some specific questions about the slides that you were presenting. I think we can go to the next slides and then the Q&A will be then. Yeah.
So now I'm moving into third part of our lecture today, which is basically to try and tell you what does this climate finance look in practice. So next slide. And I'm going to tell you the story through the work that I do at the World Bank. So what do we do at the World Bank? Remember that multilateral development banks are 75% of all climate public finance flows. So we are still the entity that's doing most of the climate finance work in the world from a public sector point of view. So we provide three things. We do financing, we bring in the best of knowledge, and thirdly, we're able to bring and convene people together on the table. So we can bring a Ministry of Finance together with a private sector player, together with Ministry of Environment to have a conversation about what needs to happen to reduce these emissions and respond. Next slide. One of the examples that I closely work on is actually in your country. Now, remember the first slide that we had mentioned is that I had mentioned the Global Environment Facility as one of the dedicated UNFCCC mechanisms to secure climate financing. So we have used that Global Environment Facility to do a project via the World Bank in Kazakhstan called the Kazakhstan Resilient Landscapes Project. It's a lot about restoration of dryland landscapes and reducing landscape degradation to build climate resilience. So out of the two, can I ask a question, Dana, to everybody? Out of the two on climate mitigation and climate adaptation, which climate finance would this come under?
Yes, let's ask from the people that are on the YouTube. So what do you think, guys? Put your answers in the comments in the live chat, please. We have some delay between the call and the streaming, so that's why maybe they will not be so quick, but Yes, there is a delay. So sorry about that. Maybe we should go, okay, yeah, adaptation. Okay. Adaptation, somewhere.
Absolutely, that's absolutely correct. So that's an adaptation finance example. But interestingly, in this project, we have both adaptation and mitigation. And the reason is because the picture that you see on the bottommost, that is one of the state-owned enterprises, the forestry enterprises we work with, and the Forestry and Wildlife Committee, which is putting unrecorded forests into the forest classification of the country. What that does is that it protects a carbon sink. Means that you have standing forests somewhere that are not in the 5% of land cover that Kazakhstan officially recognizes as forests. So as a result of that protecting carbon sink, you have some carbon benefits. So you're avoiding emission reductions by ensuring that they're protected as forests. That's number one. Number two is we also do afforestation. So we've done afforestation of almost 3,000 hectares in the drylands. So that in Kizlorda. So this also accounts for mitigation. So part of the project is mitigation, part of the project is adaptation, but rightly you pointed out that this is primarily an adaptation finance project. The codes on the screen will help you guide through project document details in case you want to learn more about what the actual project does. They're all public. There's also a really nice blog with links to previous projects that have been done by Global Environment Facility in Kazakhstan and evidence. And if you click that, and you'll see a really stark photograph of the Sairam Ugam Peak in 1901 and then at present day. And you can actually visually see how climate change has impacted that area. Next slide. So we have two types of landscape degradation in Kazakhstan. We're doing a $4.34 million GEF project, Global Environment Facility project. It's climate finance to pilot agroforestry practices using a community-centered approach and build capacity for landscape management. That means that you're working with communities on dryland agroforestry practices. I've seen the first watermelon in a very dryland area in southern Kazakhstan as a result of the activities. And you're helping build the capacity of Forestry and Wildlife Committee to do a lot of this integrated landscape management. We have another project which is very similar, which is a natural follow-on from the GEF project. And these are both grants, by the way. These are to pilot agroforestry practices, the same thing, but it will be focused on protected areas. So there are two challenges in landscape degradation in Kazakhstan. One is that there is landscape degradation at the border of productive landscapes, means where there's a lot of grazing happening, there's livestock management happening. How do you improve resilience there? And the second is at the border of protected area landscapes, means how do you improve the resilience of nature reserves, national parks? Sometimes the animals go into graze into these nature reserve protected areas and ends up in a vicious cycle of landscape degradation. So the second project is a little bit more focused on protected areas and will also look at the ecotourism strategy of the country government. So this is a very practical example of climate finance in your country. And what does an activity look like and how do you see the change visually? Next slide. This is an example of a climate impact from the GEF project. So one of the activities we're investing in is in a gene bank for climate resilient seedlings. Means they start saving the seeds that actually do better in this landscape. Means that you will go from what is the left down to the bottom to the right, a slightly greener landscape where first you sow the seeds and then you do afforestation in lines, right? And then it takes over, nature takes over as natural regeneration, resulting in a lot greener landscape. What does that help with? It helps with ensuring that, you are protecting certain areas from water loss, right? So it will help you provide water in times of need, regulate the water systems with the structural trees. It'll also help protect any kind of albedo effect that's happening from climate change. So any kind of afforestation activity will help reduce your emissions. So this also meets the growing demand. This gene bank was also meeting the growing demand for planting material for the presidential commitment. As you know, you guys have a presidential commitment to plant 2 billion trees by 2025. As a result of this activity alone, we've created 12 new jobs, half of which have been given to women. And you have an emission reduction impact because one structural tree is capable of removing 1 ton of carbon dioxide per unit hectare. So this is just one example of a climate impact on the ground. Next slide, please. Another example is another project that I've currently led, which is on climate resilient forests as well. It's protecting the forests in Turkey from wildfires. So this has been the largest wildfire management investment in World Bank history. Now see the difference. The example that I showed you in the beginning is a grant. So it's a very tiny amount and it's funneled through a global environment facility. This is a loan, okay? So, but it will be given at a very commercially low rate. So if you look at the landscape of climate finance, this falls into the majority bound. So majority of projects or majority of money moving in terms of an instrument for climate finance is like this, is like example number 2. It started with diagnostics. So we do a lot of analytics. Remember, bank also brings knowledge. So it started with the country climate and development report. And then we use that country climate development report to engage with the country government on priority investments for the country on climate change, of which wildfire was one of them. And then we started working with the agency to construct that project. Now, this project has also helped leverage sustainable finance and green finance, because the World Bank has issued a bond and used one of these projects in its portfolio to issue that sustainable bond. So that's the snapshot that I have on the right hand corner. This project is featured in the impact bond report of the World Bank this year. So there's multiple ways of how money is moved for climate change, but basically by issuing that impact bond, the World Bank is creating more with less. So we are leveraging extra money with less money. Okay, so $1 to $4 example. Moving forward, next slide. This is just a detail of what the actual project is. It's 96% climate finance. It's tagged to the green bond portfolio. And it basically improves forest management using a 5R approach. So we do review of why the fire happened. We reduce the risk through technology and other prediction methods. We improve the readiness. We ensure that there's less fuel that catches fire, means that there's less leaves lying around. The forest roads are cleared, for instance. We boost response. So we have best fire trucks that can go faster, longer. And then we do also recovery, which is the last slide. It's after the fires happen. We do recovery of the burnt areas. So this investment alone will be across 6.8 million hectares. 21,000 vulnerable households will be protected. We'll also be helping boost women-led enterprises in these areas for alternative livelihoods. So 2,000 of them will be supported and 6 million people overall will be protected from wildfires as a result of this kind of an investment. So moving forward, another way the World Bank helps is by convening, right? So the next slide is on the Uzbekistan climate change and green growth dialogues. So we convene all the different actors who were important in the Uzbekistan context. and we had co-hosted this with CAREC and with the Ministry of Economic Development and Poverty Reduction. And we hosted several sector ministries to come up with basically a common vision on how the country needs to move forward on climate change and green growth. It was also an exercise to understand what all these different terms and different ways climate change impacts each sector in the country. Next slide. So we built a common vision on a green economy transition with a couple of key priorities. And next slide. It had a lot of impact with the country government, and as a result, they had issued a decree on green economy. Okay, and then they boosted their capacity. They had a new green economy department under the Ministry of Economy and Poverty Reduction. And now we've started doing large-scale climate investments in Uzbekistan as well. So this is one of the examples of how the World Bank also operates. The last example, next slide, is on knowledge. So we bring in new ideas, we bring in new products. This is one innovative one that we have worked with the Global Environment Facility on, which is called the Rhino Bond, where you get paid. The nature reserves in South Africa will get paid some money from a bond that's issued to private sector, only if they are able to ensure that the population of rhinos doesn't fall below 30%, or in a way, you are increasing the population growth of rhinos by 70%. So this is one of the innovative ways where we're leveraging more with less. So I've covered finance, I've covered convening power, and I've covered knowledge. So those are the three ways that we help in the climate finance space as the World Bank. Next slide. I'll close a little bit with my journey so far. So I'm actually one of the one of the founding economics classes for climate change at LSE. That was in 2011. Stern started the MSc in Environmental Economics and Climate Change. So I was very lucky to study from some of the top people in the world in this space. They really influenced my thinking. But I'm an economics major by training from India, but I also was very interested in chemistry. So I done a sub-major in green chemistry while doing my economics. So I'm currently also teaching sustainable finance at Kautilya School of Public Policy back home in India. But my role at the World Bank, I started as a consultant in the Jakarta office. And then I moved to DC with something called the Young Professionals Program, which I would very much encourage you to apply as mid-career. So usually around the age of 30 to 32, that's the average age of intake. We acquire a lot of young professionals to work at the World Bank on pressing development challenges. It's a great opportunity to work on projects like the Kazakhstan project I mentioned and the Turkey project I mentioned. Before that, I was an analyst at CPI. So all the global landscape slides that you saw, that's the institution I worked for before I joined the World Bank. But like you, I also started very much in the youth space. So I was in the founding members of the Indian Youth Climate Network, some of my best years, and policy coordinator. I used to go to a lot of these UN COPs representing my country and country's youth, South Asian youth, then all the international youth. I was their focal point for climate finance for the big COP in Copenhagen. And I was the first India tracker for the Climate Tracker project, which has now become very famous. That time it was called Adopter Negotiator. So I started very much like you. So I'm really hoping that inspires you to also move into this space. Next slide. What can you do? There are multiple roles you can take. This was my time when I was a youth climate, agent of change, you could say. And I was also doing policy work with the Indian Youth Climate Network. I was talking to ministers. I got the chance to speak at the plenary at the UN, defending the Kyoto Protocol. I was going to COPs, and this is sort of where I also come from, and I'm hoping that shows you that if I can make it where I have made it, then you can also carve out your own journey in climate finance. Next slide. So I'm really passing the baton forward to the next generation of climate champions, hoping that you will do a much, much better job than all of us. And next slide, I'm leaving you with some resources as well. So there is currently a Climate Finance Academy happening. There's a call for applications, but I've also left you some resources for Climate Explainer series, fundamentals of climate change, where you can get them, country climate and development reports, as well as you must Google YOUNGO, which is the youth constituency for the UN. In case you're not already part of it, get on their list. A lot of useful information, opportunities come up. There's also a Climate Fellowships website, and then there's an IIST Climate Jobs portal. So keep these all in mind as you grow your career in this line of your career. And the last is that in case you want to make an impact, the next slide, in Kazakhstan, then, and you need to know where to go to understand, what are the recommendations for my country? What should I be working on? Where are the gaps? Where are the opportunities to showcase leadership? You can download the Kazakhstan Country Climate Development Report that we did as a World Bank. It outlines an entire pathway and some recommendations across different sectors. And we're hoping that provides you some inspiration to take some initiative on climate action. So I'll stop here.
Wow, this is so cool. Thank you, Lila. And your story is such an inspiring for me and for other, I think, participants of the lecture. We got some questions and comments during the lecture. So the first one is it possible to sell carbon credits from, for example, forest climate projects in Kazakhstan abroad?
So this is a very good question. And this is the question comes down to who owns those carbon credits, right? And if you go back to, okay, if this project is done on public sector land, right, then it will be administered through public sector policies. So that means that the Forestry and Wildlife Committee would be owning those credits. I can't see the person who's asked that question, but that would be basically the case. The Forestry and Wildlife, it's up to the Forestry and Wildlife Committee to get the owners or own those credits, as well as whether they want to sell those credits abroad. I want to explain a couple of concepts here now. Each country has an NDC commitment, right? So they would like to use any kind of activity like planting trees to account for their emission reductions under the national development contributions of the country. So this competes in a way a little bit with selling those credits abroad to another country. When you're selling those credits abroad to another country, you cannot put them in your own country's national contribution anymore, right? So the country's interest is that they put it in their own national contribution. However, this may be one way you get financing to do projects like, planting trees much faster and more efficient with private sector. So in the private sector lands, right? So if a land is not regulated by the government, at that stage, there is some room that you can sell some carbon credits. But there has been no clear regulatory signal from Kazakhstan yet. And we are working a little bit with this project called the Project Market Implementation to set up carbon markets, to set up the rules of the game in Kazakhstan, which will help provide some clarity on this very question, on whether you can sell or not. Currently, my understanding is if it's private sector land, there is still room to sell it. But if it's public sector land, there may not be any room.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. There is also one more question. So what the measures to prevent the greenwashing you can mention as the best practices and maybe particularly that are implementing in Kazakhstan or Central Asia?
Great question. So one of the ways, so there are three things that you need to look at in terms of greenwashing. One is transparency, second is robustness, and third is ambition when you're talking about climate change, okay? And the reason I say this is transparent means that you need to ensure that what emission you have reduced has actually happened, okay? Robust is you have to verify it with a third party, right? To ensure that this is not just me saying voluntarily, I have reduced 5 tons per carbon this year. I have got a third party verifier like Vera, or there are lots of institutions that can verify externally whether this emission reduction has actually happened or not. And the third is whether I would do it anyway, or is this additional, is this ambitious enough? If I was going to plant something in any case in the dry Aral seabed, and if it only survives 25% of it, then I'll keep doing the planting every year because only 25% survives. So is it really ambitious? Is it really additional to what I would have done if I would not have got any climate finance? And that helps ensure whether you can really say that this is legitimate, trusted emission reductions. What can you do? What we do at the World Bank is that we ensure that all our projects have monitoring frameworks, right? So each thing that is planted, like in the Kazakhstan project, we have 3,000 hectares, is monitored. It's monitored by our team. It's monitored by the government. We have it recorded. We have publicly put it up. We have got it that's ensuring that we're being transparent about it. It's ambitious because it's never been done in that area before. It's the first watermelon in that area, first agroforestry practice in that dryland area. And it's also ambitious because it's really large scale. So we are doing 3,000 hectares at one go in just a span of 1 or 2 years. So that's some of the ways that you can prevent greenwash. Another way is that there should be a policy signal, right? So somebody in the government needs to come up with a standard on this is what is the minimum standard for this emission reduction. If you do not meet this, we don't consider it credible. Okay. And for that, there are multiple ways to do that. But in Kazakhstan, my understanding is that you have just come up with something called a green taxonomy. Green taxonomy is one of those ways where you have a policy instrument defining what is green. So it's making it transparent. It's making it evidence-based. It's linking it to best available technology, criteria in it, and saying, okay, on this basis, we can confidently say that these activities are green, or they are carbon neutral, or they are, climate action related. And the private sector can now start investing in this area confidently, knowing that they're using these standards defined in the green taxonomy. So the green taxonomy is another way, you could say, where you are building a little bit credibility in the market and transparency on what is green. Despite that, there will be a little bit of greenwash. This I've come across in my lectures when I've been teaching sustainable finance. It's hard to avoid 100% greenwash. Very hard to avoid. But if you put in the right policy frameworks and you do a lot of transparency, robustness, and ambitiousness checks, you could get to a place where you're avoiding a lot of greenwash that's happening in the system. So these are 3 ways.
Thank you so much. We also, I think, in order to not to take a lot of time from your side, there is 2 more questions, and they're different ones. So first is, what do you know about the water stress in Central Asia, mostly Kazakhstan? I think it's a big climatic problem now. So what do you think about that, just in terms of the climate finance also?
Great question. I think there was a water forum that was held in Singapore recently, and they also brought it up. I think I'll answer this personally because I don't work in the water team at the bank. But there is a huge water stress. It's, you've had one of the biggest environmental disasters in the region, with the Aral Sea Basin drying up. So it is a huge issue. There's no doubt about it. What you do about it is there are multiple regional, that's why you have a regional diplomacy initiative for water. You have, planting trees, getting the ecosystem back the way it was is one way of intervening. We have some water projects that might be coming up with the World Bank that are looking at this issue very in great detail, that are focusing just on reducing water stress. But recently we've produced an adaptation policy note in which it is highlighted as one of the key recommendations. You can see that I think we published it. If we've not, then I'll put it up when it's published. I'll send it to Dana. One of the key recommendations is in the water stress and water sector. And we are trying to engage the government in dialogue to ensure that they put it in the adaptation plan. So another way moving forward is that government having a robust adaptation plan for the country, a national adaptation plan, reflecting what they will be doing on water would be a good step forward.
Thank you. And one more question. It's more about the personal and professional experience of you. So could you please suggest if young specialists today would like to connect their profession with climate change, should they select more specific master degrees like climate change or green economy or other? So what would be your suggestion for the educational programs that people should take to be involved more in this field professionally?
So great question. As you know now, everybody requires to be in the climate change movement. Okay, so regardless, let's say you don't follow a core climate career, right? Let's say you are a teacher, you continue being a teacher. Let's say you're a banker, you continue being a banker. You will all have the chance and the opportunity to weave climate change into your daily work. Okay, so you could be at a bank and then say, okay, let's start a team that looks at climate risks of our exposure. Let's start a team that looks at, solutions in terms of de-risking instruments for climate finance. You could be a teacher and say, let's start a new module on climate change. You could be a transport engineer and say, okay, can I design this bridge a little bit differently if I take climate change into my model, into my normal model that I model out to calculate how the bridge should be designed. So you can do this regardless of a degree. I just wanted to put that point forward first. You don't need a degree to work on climate action. You can drive the climate element within your organization or within your sector by just taking small initiatives in your current role. Having said that, it's good to build credibility. It's good to build legitimacy in this area because that's going to be the main currency. As you see, like one of the questions you've asked is there are concerns on greenwashing, right? If you feel that there is something that you want to learn a little bit more on, you can take a certification. If you were in banking, you could have taken an ESG CFA or a client, SCR, it's called Sustainability and Climate Risk Certification, and move forward. If you're at a stage where you're looking at master's degrees and you've decided you only want to work on climate, sure, go ahead. But know that even if you do a master's in economics or a master's in engineering, it has no climate element, you can still focus your thesis on climate impact and whatever, transport design of a bridge. Okay, so don't limit yourself in terms of just doing a climate degree, but do it in case you want, this is what you want to do for the rest of your life. If you're absolutely clear, move ahead. And there are multiple courses, many universities offer it. I went to the first one in 2010, 2011, but now everybody is offering a climate change course. You can even subspecialize. You can go for a carbon management course. You can go for a climate finance course. You can go for a sustainability finance course, master's. You can go for climate engineering. So there are multiple different strands of the sector that you can take up. So don't limit yourself.
That's inspiring. Yes, I think that it's a key point about the professional development of any who wants to be involved in the climate agenda. It's possible just to start maybe from the basics of the knowledge, and then everyone can be somehow working in this field. Actually, we have some more questions, but I'm not sure about the time that you have for...
I can take one more because I have another.
Let's do one more and we will, Okay, so we have, the question is, what stimulus measures should be introduced, in your opinion, to encourage private sector financing in climate area?
Okay, great question. I mean, we're trying to answer this as well, but I can give you some examples from work that we've done or I've done personally as well. So one of the ways is that you bring in a fiscal incentive. So if a government is investing some money, they say, okay, where do we put the money in so that we only need to put the money in once and then private sector can put it in later, right? So a good example of a fiscal incentive is tax, or you can either use carbon tax strategically, right? So you tax the coal producers. In India, they tax the coal producers. They move the money into a National Renewable Energy Development Fund. And the National Renewable Energy Development Fund funded startups on energy, renewable energy, solar firms, solar producers, panel producers. They all received a subsidy from that fund. So that's one way the fiscal incentive can be used. You get some money in and you move it to an area where you give grants to a lot of different producers who are solving the problem. Okay, that's one way. Another way could be that you de-risk. So say, for instance, there's a lot of talk about green hydrogen. Right now, when I started, there was a lot of talk about solar. Not a lot of people were confident that solar will scale. 10 years, 20 years ago, they were not sure that it will scale. So there are a lot of banks who are really nervous in putting money in. Like, we cannot give you a debt we will not give you a loan of $20 million to start a solar farm. So what happened in that case is that the World Bank or other institutions can come to de-risk it. They'll say, well, we'll take on the risk. Let's do one project. So in Indonesia, I was involved in the first, when I was working in the Ministry of Finance there, they were trying to de-risk geothermal investments. And the first big geothermal investment of 2 gigawatt was only made sometime in 2020. So it took 5 years for us to figure out how to de-risk it, do one investment. When you do one investment, then the other private sector players can come in and say, okay, this is working. This is proof of concept. This is working. Let's also invest our money in this. So that's another way. So I've given you 2 examples. The third way is you bring in private sector in your existing activity. I've been working closely in Turkey with the Nature Conservation and Nature Tourism Department. They have a public-private partnership, means that they protect the area, the nature reserve. So they're protecting that area from climate change, doing the management of that area, ensuring the forest health. But they're creating a revenue stream. So they are saying, we will lease it out to private sector to bring in ticket revenue, right? So people entering the park will pay a ticket. We'll also tell them to build a camp, like a cabin, type of glamping area. And so people will also come into that nature reserve, but in a controlled manner, right? And we will get the revenue from the glamping. So that's an example of public-private partnership. So that's the third way you can bring in. So I've given you 3 examples. One is a fiscal incentive, one is a PPP, public-private partnership, and the third is like de-risking. So these are 3 ways you can bring in private sector in your projects.
Thank you. Yes, we have plenty of comments about how inspiring your experience is, and everybody is they are thanking you for the great lecture. So thank you again, Lila, for your contribution. This is such an honor for us to have a lecture from your side. And I hope that we will also be translating this streaming to Kazakh, so it will be subtitles in Kazakh language to make the knowledge that you shared more impactful to those who speak Kazakh language as well. Thank you again, and wish you a good day in DC. It's early morning, so thank you for your contribution.
Thanks, Dana, and to everybody. And my last messages, do get in touch. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very happy to mentor young people, and of course, I keep coming to Kazakhstan for supervision of the project. So I'm happy to meet you all informally as well. And listen, if I've done it, you can do it. And I'm really hoping, because we need more people in the climate action fight. We need everybody to be on board. So I'm really hoping you guys will take on the baton and do great things in this sector.
Thank you, Lila. So we're finishing our lecture, and thank you for everyone who were